welcome to this edition of the Head to Head Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and in this edition of the Head to Head Podcast, I will be looking at two Red Sox pitchers who have achieved great regular season success, but have lacked postseason success in the forms of David Price and Rick Porcello. Let's start it off by looking at David Price, who's been in the major leagues 11 years with 137 wins and 74 losses. A career 3.29 ERA, 200 strikeouts 5 times, 200 innings 6 times. 5-time All-Star, Cy Young in 2012, 2-time earned run average leader in 2012 and 2015. 2014, he was a strikeout leader. He makes $30 million a year, but he has a postseason record of 2-8 with a 5.03 ERA. So most of that sounds good, but it's not all rainbows and butterflies for David Price. Let's look at his career with the 4 teams that he's played with. He is 82-47 in Tampa, 33-18 currently in Boston, 13-8 in Detroit, and he was 9-1 in his shortest stint with the Blue Jays. So David Price has had most success that could be asked for of him. He was an up-and-comer. He's reached that level of success and fame, and he was, and maybe is, one of the better pitchers to pitch in the American League. In the American League East, he's been in Tampa, now he's been in Boston, he's had success. But most of that success happened before he came to Boston and signed that huge deal for $30 million a year with the Red Sox. Most of his success comes in Tampa, where clearly the market size wasn't the same. They didn't have ticket sales. They didn't have people complain about him. They didn't have the media. And the media has become David Price's biggest enemy, it seems like. Whenever he is criticized, the next start, he has huge failures. He has had arguments with the likes of Dennis Eckersley, some Red Sox reporters. I don't know, he gets defensive every time people want to talk about baseball. He seems to want the money, the fame, the glory, but he doesn't want to be criticized. And that's a huge problem in today's age where reporters are everywhere in Boston. They're everywhere in New York. They're not there in Tampa. They weren't there in Toronto, and they weren't there in Detroit. And now he's in a huge, huge market. And it doesn't seem like he's happy, and it doesn't seem like the money is helping him get over the fact that he is criticized for every single start and every single outing he is in a baseball uniform. That's just how it is. In the offseason, he tweeted about, I don't want to talk about my postseason anymore. I don't want to talk about it. All he did was, he was the one who started to bring it up again, and it's like he just doesn't understand. He seems like he's tone deaf when he talks about things at the wrong time to talk about things, and he doesn't want to talk about things when it's time to talk about things. He should talk about his starts after they happen. He was talking about how he couldn't be able to pitch in New York because he's playing video games, and then he goes out and he pitches bad in New York. So that joke turned into a reality because he made that joke. And now it looks bad on David Price. David Price's stint with the Red Sox has been bad, except for that first year when he was 17-11, and people thought it was bad then. I was one of the few who thought he actually had a pretty decent season. For me, Price seems like this guy who was sick and tired of being traded. He was traded from Tampa to Detroit, then traded from Detroit to Toronto. So he just signed a big deal with the biggest offer, and he made it so he couldn't get traded. So he signed a huge $30 million a year deal, knowing that nobody would ever trade for that contract. That's what it seems like to me. He wanted to know where he was going to pitch for the next 7 years. He got his wish, and now, like most wishes, when the genie grants the wish, you're unhappy with what's happened. And David Price seems unhappy in Boston, and he's not going to opt out of that contract because he's not going to give up $30 million a year for the next 4 years just because he's unhappy. Because if he opts out of that, he's not even going to get $20 million a year. At best, right now, I think David Price will get about $10 to $12 million a year on the free agent market. Why would I sign him? He's minutes away from exploding into an injury. He's minutes away from coming up with a reason why he can't pitch. I mean, who's looking at what's happening with the Red Sox nonsense and going, you know who I want in my clubhouse and around my teammates, David Price. The players love him, but why no other big markets who could have the money to get him would want him? He has proven he's not a big market pitcher, yet he wants to be paid like a big market pitcher. If he wants to leave and go to a small town, Milwaukee, go back to Tampa, that he would have to take a huge, huge discount, which I know for a fact David Price is not willing to do. The fact of the matter is, this is a marriage between Price and the Red Sox that's going to last 4 years too long. It should end tomorrow. It's not. So far this year, yeah, he's like 10-4 with a 4.21 ERA. But he's not good. He's not good. It's frustrating to watch. You're not going to win the World. He's going to be the reason you're not going to win the World Series. Because they need him to be at his best. But his head is up in the clouds and mad at people. If he just settled down and pitch, they are one of the best teams in the league right now. But they would be the definitive favorites to win the World Series if Price were pitching up to his capabilities. And so far with the Red Sox, his entire career there, he has not, except for that first year. David Price's feelings were hurt, and he's never been able to recover from that. Because the fact of the matter is, if he had that 17-11 season with the Tampa Bay, he would be considered great. But in Boston, the measurements are different. The wins mean more. The losses mean a lot more. We needed him to be Chris Sale, and now Chris Sale has become him, so he doesn't seem to be the guy anymore, and I think that frustrates him to a huge degree. He wants to be the ace, and he's not, and he's never going to be again. So far, since David Price has been with the Red Sox, he's been overshadowed by two different pitchers, which he's never been before in his whole career. He's been overshadowed by Chris Sale, and now... And since he's gone to the Red Sox, he's been overshadowed by Rick Porcello. That's the sad fact of the career that's happened to David Price. Yes, he's going to make $30 million a year, but he is never going to get what he wants again, to be the best pitcher on a baseball team. Because as long as he stays with the Red Sox and they have Price and they have Porcello, there's always going to be a question, who's the best pitcher? It's going to be Sale as long as Sale's here. And if Sale leaves, then yeah, we can have that argument again. But as long as there's a Sale and maybe there's a Porcello, Price is not going to be the best starting pitcher on a team. And he wants to be the Clayton Kershaw guy. He wants to be the Madison Bumgarner. He does. But he thought he wanted that in a big market. It just turns out he deserves that in a much smaller market. David Price's biggest successes in the postseason has come as a relief pitcher. Even when he was with Toronto and they made the playoffs, he was a reliever and he was good. When he first came up with the Rays, he was the closer. He struck out J.D. Drew in an epic at-bat to help the Rays get to the World Series. Last year with the Red Sox, even though they were abysmal, he was the one star of their postseason. But the sad fact is if he starts a postseason game, it will probably not end well for David Price and the Red Sox. I think he's one of the best pitchers I've seen pitch. But he's not a big market pitcher. He's just not. He's proven he's not, and some guys just can't take the heat in the big city, and he seems to be that guy. In an average season, David Price averages 16 wins and 9 losses. But since he's got to the Red Sox, he has not been that good. If he can get back to being that guy, then he's valuable to the Red Sox. But until then, he's just not that guy. Now let's look at Rick Porcello, who's been in the league 10 years. He has 129 wins and 102 losses, a career 4.21 ERA. He's had 200 innings just 3 times. He averages 15 wins and 12 losses, which doesn't sound great, but we'll get to his greatness in a minute. Detroit, he was 76-63. In Boston, he is 53-39. Rick Porcello wasn't flashy, let's say the first 6 or 7 years of his career. He could average between 10 and 14 wins. But then something happened. He had his Jim Lonborg season. Jim Lonborg had that season with the 1967 Red Sox and won a Cy Young. That's exactly what happened with Rick Porcello in 2016. He won the Cy Young in 2016. He won the Comeback Player of the Year in 2016. He was coming off a terrible year. He had just been given a $21 million a year contract, and he finally lived up to that deal, going 22-4 and beating Justin Verlander for the Cy Young Award. Rick Porcello has never been to an All-Star game. He's not a well-known pitcher. He's not a Clayton Kershaw. He's not even a David Price in the names if I go across other cities and talk about athletes and star pitchers. Rick Porcello is not a star pitcher, but he had that one dominant season, and he won the Cy Young. He won a Cy Young, which is the most surprising Cy Young I've probably ever seen. He was one of the best pitchers at home, particularly, I've ever seen at Fenway Park. He was dominant. But since the Cy Young year, there have been ups and downs. Last year, he lost a ton of ball games. 19 games he lost. This year, bounced back. He's 11-3 as I do this podcast right now, coming off a win. Rick Porcello has been a better member of the Red Sox than David Price, and that's what makes this argument so interesting between who's better of the two. David Price clearly has the better numbers, clearly has the strikeouts, the ERAs, the titles. But so far, this season, Porcello better. So far, since they got to the Red Sox in the same year, Porcello better. Rick Porcello has been a better member of the Red Sox than David Price. Yes, David Price has pitched better in other places, but I think Rick Porcello has proven something that David Price has not. Rick Porcello is a big market pitcher. He has been to a World Series with the Tigers. Yeah, he wasn't great. He doesn't have a postseason win yet. He's 0-3 with a 5.47 ERA. But he's proven, at the very least, that during a regular season, he can be a part of a winning team in a big market. David Price has been part of winning teams in smaller markets, but there is something different when you are a pitcher in bigger markets. We have seen other guys collapse. Matt Harvey had success there, and then he had failures there. David Price has not proven he's had successes yet. Rick Porcello has had successes in Boston. That season, he carried the Red Sox in a year before they had Chris Sale, in a year when they were relying on David Price and he didn't live up to the hype. That was the year Rick Porcello took the bull by the horn and became the best pitcher in the American League for that 1 year. I don't know if Rick Porcello is ever going to have another season like that. It's hard to predict that, but that is his year. That is probably going to be the best year of his career, and it's not a year that David Price is ever going to have as a member of the Boston Red Sox. And one guy is the guy getting paid $30 million, the other guy is getting paid $21 million. It seems like those two numbers should be reversed. I don't think Rick Porcello is worth $30 million a year or even $21 million a year. But he has proven he is more valuable to the Boston Red Sox than David Price. Overall, of course, David Price is a better pitcher than Rick Porcello. Rick Porcello might not even have half the career that David Price has. 129 and 102 is not the same as 137 and 74. But the smaller market thing matters to me, and it should matter to most people. Sonny Gray is struggling in New York after being a great pitcher with Oakland. There have been case after case after case after case of guys succeeding in smaller markets and then going to the bigger markets and choking. John Lackey proved that he could go from L.A. to Boston to St. Louis to Chicago and win. 3 World Series with those teams. He was a winning pitcher. He was a big market pitcher. Josh Beckett was Florida. Then he went to Boston and he proved he was a big market pitcher. David Price has proven he is not a big market performer. Rick Porcello has proven that he can perform in those big markets, and that makes him better overall for the Red Sox right now than David Price. What's interesting about Porcello, though, is he has proven he can't be consistent year after year after year, win 20 games, win 15 games. He's going to have a great year, then he's going to have an off year, but he's still getting $21 million either way. David Price has proven he's been on, mostly off, for the Red Sox. 1 year he was on, 3 years he's off now. Well, 2 years he's off now. And just since David Price has gotten to the Red Sox, he has shown no level of consistency. And Rick Porcello has shown no level of consistency. They're both equally inconsistent starting pitchers for the Red Sox. But I would rather have Rick Porcello for the next 3 to 4 years than David Price. I am one of those fans rooting for David Price to opt out of his $30 million contract a year. He's not going to do that because, like I said, the free agent market last year was terrible. No one got paid, and there are going to be better starters on the market. And no small market team has the money that David Price wants. David Price was granted his wish And like those movies where the genie grants the wish and the wish goes haywire like Aladdin, it hasn't gone well. David Price wished himself to be a prince, and he's about to lose all of Agrabah. All right, that was a terrible Aladdin reference, but you get my point. David Price has been given what he wants, stardom and money. But guess what? He doesn't want the stardom part. He wants the money, and he wants to be the best pitcher on the team, and he's not even that. There are two other guys who are Cy Young contenders, and one of them has won a Cy Young since he got to Boston. David Price has not been in the Cy Young conversation at any point in his 3 years in Boston. Rick Porcello has won one, Chris Sale has finished second, and will probably, most likely, win one before it's all said and done with the Red Sox. And David Price, your $30 million a year player, is not even in the conversation. The Red Sox don't want this guy. They don't want this guy. He's a headache and a half with the video game playing, the talking about his dog, the not caring about pitching. He's over it, because once a guy gets paid, he is one of those guys who relaxes. We saw with Pablo Sandoval. We saw with Adrian Gonzalez to a lesser extent. We've seen it with Carl Crawford. David Price is going to be in that category of Red Sox free agents that didn't pan out. Rick Porcello, they got him when he was young. They gave him the 4-year contract, $21 million a year. So far, has he lived up to the total amount of the contract? No. But if he has 2 or 3 really good years out of that contract, it was a pretty good contract. I don't think the next 4 years, if David Price opts in, he's going to have 3 good years of it. I would much rather keep Rick Porcello than lose David Price. Rick Porcello is a free agent in 2019. So they'll probably end up losing Rick Porcello and be stuck with David Price. And I think that's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. But it's a mistake that they can't control, because David Price is going to opt in. They're going to have to pay Sale. They're not going to be able to pay Rick Porcello. And he's going to leave. And he's won a Cy Young. He's entertaining to watch. He's one of the best home pitchers in the league. I don't know. I'd want to keep Rick Porcello over David Price. Rick Porcello's postseason numbers are short sample size. David Price is 2-8 with a 5.03 ERA and 0-8 as a starting pitcher who makes $30 million a year. If I had to bet on one of the two doing well in the postseason as starting pitchers, not relievers, I would bet all of my money on Rick Porcello, not David Price. I have zero faith that David Price can have a quality postseason start. Zero faith. If they make him a reliever, he can have some success, but that success doesn't impress me very much, because it had zero impact on them losing to the Astros last season. With Rick Porcello, I believe he can be a quality postseason starter, preferably at home, because he's a way better pitcher at home than he is on the road. But in this edition of the Head to Head podcast, I have to name David Price the winner. But I do think overall, Rick Porcello could turn out to be a better overall pitcher for the Red Sox than David Price. I think that's arguably. Right now, I think Rick Porcello is better than David Price, but overall, I think David Price is a better pitcher than Rick Porcello, and I don't think you can really argue that. But right now, at this moment, I think you can have that conversation. Both of these guys have Cy Youngs. Both of these guys pitch for the Red Sox. One of these guys is doing really well with the Red Sox, and one of these guys isn't. That's what sports is about. Who is doing better for their teams at this time? What you did before doesn't matter to what you're doing now, and Rick Porcello is better right now than David Price. But overall, yes, clearly David Price has far succeeded Rick Porcello in stats and his prominence as a pitcher. There's a reason he's making $30 million a year. But the fact of the matter is, David Price has failed to prove he is a big game pitcher who can pitch in a big market. Yes, he's done good in Toronto, Detroit, and Tampa. But when it comes to big city pitching, he's not done well at all. And he's proven he's a small market pitcher who took the money and ran with it and hasn't been the same since. He is the winner of this edition of Head to Head, though, because I can't argue that Rick Porcello has had a better career. But I think over the next 5 years, he could get into that discussion as being just as good as David Price because, let's face it, he's won the Cy Young and he's had moments of success. He hasn't made the All-Star game. He should have made the All-Star game when he won the Cy Young. I don't know why he didn't win the All-Star game. Go to the All-Star game last year or this year. He's 11-3, and he hasn't even been discussed as possibly being an All-Star. That's crazy to me. I think Rick Porcello could end up in the same category as David Price. I think Rick Porcello will be more beloved by Red Sox fans than David Price because hopefully Rick Porcello will be a huge part of a World Series winning team. I don't see David Price being part of that team. I don't think he'll get injured. He'll get his $30 million a year, but he won't be a big part of the winning. That's why I thought this discussion was interesting, because both pitchers had past success. But in this market, Rick Porcello is clearly the top dog over David Price. Red Sox fans have no issues with Rick Porcello. Even though he makes $21 million a year, he proved he can win a Cy Young here. He can live up to the hype. David Price has shown no signs of living up to the hype for Red Sox fans. Red Sox fans are sick and tired of having this discussion about David Price. Just win ball games. David Price talks too much about outside factors other than winning. David Price can have all his money and all of his numbers, but it might be Rick Porcello who gets all of the glory. David Price wins this edition of the Head to Head Podcast over Rick Porcello. Thank you for listening to the Head to Head Podcast. I'm Cam McKinney, and remember to rate, review, and subscribe on the iTunes podcast app. Thanks for listening.